Channel's Week in Review. Israel at war, the voices of the Bible, the voice of Fran Drescher, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. Israel is at war, or seems to be, as we prepare to go to air this week. More than 40,000 reserve troops have been called up by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, with the Prime Minister declaring he wants to, quote, take off the gloves in fighting Hamas. This follows on an air campaign in which Israel has struck hundreds of targets in the past week or so. The reason for Israel's planned incursion into Gaza is the barrage of rockets coming into Israel from that Palestinian territory. In 2 days earlier this week, Israel estimated that 130 rockets had been shot into Israel. We'll be following this story as it continues to develop. Of course, it's hard to ignore a proximate event that has also fueled concern about Hamas within Israel in recent weeks, which is the kidnapping and murder of 3 teenagers. The continuing fallout from that murder continues to dominate discussion around Israel. It's a discussion that's come to be increasingly centered around what Israeli authorities have declared a revenge killing targeting a Palestinian teenager. 16-year-old Mohammed Abu Khader was burned to death, according to a medical examiner's report that found he had inhaled smoke while still alive. 6 Jewish suspects have been arrested for alleged involvement in the teenager's murder. As we go to air, their identities have not yet been released. The killings have been the ostensible reason for days of riots in Gaza. In the midst of all of this somewhat sudden violence, a message from President Barack Obama that had presumably been in the works for some time was published in the Israeli English newspaper Haaretz on Tuesday. In the op-ed, the president spoke of America's historical relationship with the Jewish state and the current commitment among the two countries to mutual security, including a discussion of the president's commitment to keep Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. But the most discussed passages deal with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and the recent breakdown in peace talks. Obama wrote in part, quote, "As I said last year in Jerusalem, peace is necessary, just, and possible. I believed it then, I believe it now. Peace is necessary because it's the only way to ensure a secure and democratic future for the Jewish state of Israel. While walls and missile defense systems can help protect against some threats, true safety will only come with a comprehensive negotiated settlement. Reaching a peace agreement with the Palestinians would also help turn the tide of international sentiment and sideline violent extremists, further bolstering Israel's security." Moving on, if there's a voice that speaks to the Jewish experience, actor Fran Drescher's distinct and iconic voice, recently heard on Broadway, certainly relates an aspect of Jewish culture. Meredith Gansman reports.
I'm looking for an unknown, a fresh face with a unique voice.
It's in the medicine chest! Between the corn pants and the Monistat 7!
I've found my Juliet.
This is not the typical voice for a Broadway musical, but leave it to a flashy girl from Flushing to make it to Broadway. That's the nanny named Fran Drescher, who recently starred in Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella. To cap off her Broadway run, she was honored with the unveiling of her own character at the famous New York Theater District restaurant, Sardi's.
It's such an honor, and I feel like I'm just getting such a wonderful cross-section of the best of Broadway, and I'm so appreciative that the community has welcomed me so.
Drescher's road to Broadway has been a long one. She got her start in small movie roles in Saturday Night Fever and Spinal Tap. When she created and starred in The Nanny, Broadway played a special role.
I've always loved Broadway and respected it, and that was why on The Nanny we made Mr. Sheffield a Broadway producer, because we always felt like if the show's going to take place in New York, what better way to depict New York than with, the glamour and thrill of live theater and the Broadway community.
It's been 16 years since The Nanny went off the air after 6 seasons. In case you forgot, Fran Fine on the show, was there at the Sheffield's door to sell makeup. The father sold more. She became the family's nanny and eventually Mrs. Sheffield. This nanny had chutzpah. The Nanny was one of the first TV series since 1949's The Goldbergs to be shaped around an openly Jewish character. But it almost didn't happen that way.
At some point, they wanted to make my character Italian when we were writing the pilot. And we said no because it wouldn't be as good. I didn't really know how to be Italian as well as I knew how to be Jewish.
For many years before The Nanny, Jewish television characters often served as sidekicks and supporting roles, the nutty neighbor or local Yenta. Think the Mary Tyler Moore Show's Rhoda Morgenstern, not The Nanny. She went to temple, dated a cantor, and visited a kibbutz. The show never strayed far from home.
Well, all the rich and wonderful, humorous, colorful people that I grew up with in Queens. And that was to be my family and my friends.
Drescher's own comedy icon also inspired The Nanny. Fran always tried to get into Maxwell Sheffield's Broadway productions. Remind you of another TV comedian?
I'm always very honored when people compare me to her because she is, one of my idols, and I've learned so much just by watching her on television.
For more from Fran Drescher, tune into the full broadcast version of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Meredith. Finally, who wrote the Bible and how are we meant to experience it? A series of scholars and authors examine that question on this week's episode of Up Close. Michael Karasik is a Bible scholar and religious Jew who is editing a new series of commentators' Bibles for the Jewish Publication Society. But he's also someone who can see the different voices in the biblical text, and he speaks to those in his book, The Bible's Many Voices. Michael Satlow is a professor of religious studies at Brown University, and he examines how the Bible came together and what happened as it did. His book is How the Bible Became Holy. And finally, James Martin is a Jesuit Catholic priest and an editor at the Jesuit magazine America. When he decided to write a book about Jesus' life, he took a 2-week journey to Israel to do so. What he finds and how he combines notions of truth, authenticity, and devotion is the subject of his book, Jesus, A Pilgrimage. Here are some of the highlights from my interview with Michael Satlow. When you read the Bible a certain way, with an eye towards kind of what's being said about the Bible in the Bible, and how it's being received by the audiences, that time and again, for literally hundreds of years, you had efforts to make it popular, and people wanted little to do with it.
Sure, and that in a way it's easy to see because people have a particular way of doing things, right? Most people at most times, especially in antiquity and in maybe some other than Western cultures, they do things in a particular way because their parents did them, and their parents' parents did them, and their village does them, and their town does them, and the like. And now imagine somebody comes along with the text, and they say, hey, it says in the text you're doing things in the wrong way, right? So how do you react? For most Jews and Israelites before them, it would have been, what's right, the text or how we've been doing things? And for most people, it's how they've been doing things.
It's interesting how at various points in your book, it feels like the experience of Jews, I guess at this point, 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago, feels a lot in your narrative like the experience we talk about of Jews of today, where there's this back and forth, and people are moving from place to place, and some of the traditions stay, and some of them go.
I think in some ways, it's a little different today because tradition, that kind of mimetic tradition, that was really important in antiquity. In a way, today, we, in our culture, we value novelty. We're not afraid to say we have personal authority and we can change things, and things do change and move a lot quicker today. So in antiquity, they didn't so much. They were looked at, very differently. But that same kind of tension, between text and what we do, what somebody tells you to do because it's written here, and what you really do, that goes way back.
We can never know the whole picture of what happened 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 500 years ago. And what survives is what we get to learn about these old communities from. But that for today's Jewish community, if you, again, were to go by the texts and you were to go by the very obvious signs of Jewish ritual and practice, you'd get a very different view of the Jewish community than you and I would have just looking around.
Right, and I think that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize in the book too, is this, there's complexity. There are different dynamics, there are real people. Sometimes we talk about texts as if they are actors on their own stage, or they're actors in history. Texts don't act, people act. People give them authority, they do things, they do things with them, they do things by them, all kinds of interactions with texts. That's a complexity that we have today, and it's a complexity that I think we had, back in the biblical period.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast, available on iTunes or on your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 528, IO Optimum Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, Cox Cable Channel 1, Frontier Communications, and on Comcast in the on-demand menu.